Hi again, and tonight we're going to talk about biochemistry. So, what does biochemistry mean? Well, bio means living, and chemistry, of course, means of chemicals. So, it's the chemistry of living things. So, to start off with, we're going to define a couple terms that are important in understanding biochemistry. Living things have both organic and inorganic components to them, and we're first going to define organic compounds. Remember, a compound is atoms that are put together to make a new structure. And so organic compounds are found as part of living things and are made of carbon. And some examples include carbohydrates, such as sugars and starches, lipids, fats and waxes, proteins, and nucleic acids, which include DNA and RNA. Inorganic compounds are those which are not made up of carbon, and it's where two substances in which two or more chemical elements other than carbon are combined. Inorganic compounds do not contain carbon and hydrogen together. So some examples are water and then carbon dioxide, because it does contain carbon, but it doesn't have a hydrogen with it, so thus it is not an organic compound. So let's go over the elements that are found in living things, and these 6 elements make up the bulk of all living things. The first one is found in water, H2O, and it's the H2 part, hydrogen. Considering so much of living organisms are made up of water, it should be not a surprise that hydrogen is one of the most important elements for this. Oxygen, also another important one. Of course, we breathe it in, but the reason we do is it's used in many parts of our body and is found in many of the compounds there. The next one, carbon. Carbon is, if all living things are have carbon structures as their basic parts, and of course carbon is going to be one of them. Nitrogen, and we'll be talking a little bit about nitrogen, where it is found. It's one of our most important ones. Phosphorus, and finally calcium. So these 6 make up the majority of all the living things. First, we're going to talk about hydrogen. Hydrogen is the simplest and most abundant element in the universe. So with its 1 proton in the nucleus and its 1 electron in its outside shell, it is a very simple structure. 75% of matter known to exist is made of hydrogen, and it's an important structural element for molecules making up living things. One of the most important things about hydrogen is that as it moves from location to location, from compound to compound, or it's taking on, it gets taken up by another compound, it can change the configuration of the compound it leaves or changes the compound it enters, and that movement is involved in some key chemical reactions in in our bodies, but in all living things. Oxygen. Well, oxygen has a cycle, and so almost all living things need oxygen, and they use this oxygen during the process of creating energy in living cells. So they have this oxygen cycle. One of the most important uses of oxygen you can see here in photosynthesis. So on this slide, you can see the chemical reaction of photosynthesis, where 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, so you see 6 CO2, plus 12 molecules of water, when they are added together and light hits them, as well as some enzymes, you end up with 1 molecule of glucose, which we'll be learning more about, but that's C6H12O6, which is the molecule of glucose. It also, then the result of this chemical reaction, that's why it's on that side of the arrow, is 6 O2, which is oxygen. So oxygen is let off of this, and plus 6H2O, and there's oxygen again. So you see how much oxygen is involved for this very important process of photosynthesis. The next one is carbon. And carbon is a perfect element to build very, very big molecules with. And that's why it's pretty important in all living things, because the molecules we need in our cells for all major functions are made of carbon. Carbon also has 4 bonding spots in its outside shell, and so it loves to bond with other carbon molecules and nitrogen and oxygen, so it can structurally make some really interesting and important parts. Nitrogen. Nitrogen is the most prevalent element in the atmosphere. It's 78% of all the air we find in the atmosphere is actually nitrogen. If you were to write that, you'd write N2, because nitrogen, when it's found in the air, it can be in different forms, but the most abundant form is N with a subscript 2, and so that's the most abundant form. It's an important element of proteins, and it's also found in nucleic acids. The next element we're looking at is phosphorus. Phosphorus is an important element in proteins and for the transfer of energy. Phosphorus is also the glue that holds DNA together, so for both these reasons, it's obviously something very important. On this slide, you can see the phosphorus cycle, where you have rocks and soil, and that's the source of phosphorus. And as it erodes away, you get runoff into lakes and streams, and you get inorganic phosphorus. This is taken up in the form of phosphate, and for instance, farmers and stuff will put phosphate on their fields as a way to increase phosphorus because it's such an important element for plants. And it'll be metabolized through ATP and then decomposition. Next one is calcium, and in plants it is important for the use of nitrogen to have this calcium available. It's also found in bones and other organic molecules. We're all told to drink our milk, and that's because we need that calcium. Calcium is also abundant in inorganic elements in higher animals as well. Now, before we go too much further with our macromolecule unit, I want to make sure we get some definitions down. Number 1 is atoms. Atoms are a basic unit of a chemical element. I just want to make sure you all know when we're talking about atoms what they are, because we're going to be talking about atoms, and of course these elements are made up of atoms, and then we're going to have compounds that are made up of multiple atoms put together. So knowing this is, when we talked about 8 characteristics of living things, one of them was having an organizational structure, and this organizational structure starts with atoms. So we're going to be talking about them. Then we have subatomic particles. So your atoms are made up of 3 major particles, and actually you can further break it down, but we'll just, for the case of biology, we'll just keep it here. You have protons, which are positively charged. Neutrons, also found in the nucleus, just like protons. They are neutrally charged, or they do not have a charge. And electrons that have a negative charge. So if you look at this picture here, 3p plus, that's referring to the protons. 3n with the superscript 0 is referring to the neutrons, which do not have a charge. And then in the first shell around the nucleus, you have a maximum of 2 electrons, and that's shown in here with its 2e minus, referring to the 2 electrons in that first shell. Then you go to the second shell, because after the first shell is filled, then you move to the second shell. The first shell is filled at 2 electrons. The second shell is filled at 8 electrons, so you have 1e minus, that's 1 electron in that next shell. And that's referring to, this would be lithium, this particular picture here. So, just to look at how, again, these charges, protons with a positive charge, neutrons with no charge, and electrons with a negative charge. You'll also notice with the mass that the mass of protons and neutrons are nearly the same, but electrons are hardly of any mass. So that's just to remind you of some things you probably learned last year at some other point, but to keep that fresh in your memory. Atomic structure. Electrons are arranged in energy levels or shells around the nucleus of an atom. Okay, so you may have heard the term Bohr's model, or you may have even constructed one in last year, the year before. And that you would have a nucleus in the center with the protons and neutrons in it, and then you'd have the energy shells outside of them where the electrons are. In the first shell, as we were mentioning earlier, you have a maximum of 2 electrons. Make sure you get that down, because you'll be using it in this class. You will also be using it in classes you take in the future here. The second shell is a maximum of 8 electrons, and the third shell also with a maximum of 8 electrons. Again, once a shell is filled, then the electrons go to fill the next energy level. So, in summary, the elements making up most of the body of living things include hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and calcium. The atomic number of an atom equals the number of protons in the nucleus. The atomic mass of an atom is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in the nucleus. Electrons orbit the nucleus in its shells, and each shell can only carry a set number of electrons. So this is just a little review of some basic atomic structure things you've probably learned, as well as our introduction to the elements that make up most of living things. Thanks.